So question 3, also from Levi, or for anyone to answer. How does propertarianism navigate the tension between preserving cultural heritage and allowing for the natural evolution and experimentation inherent in fine art and architectural practices? And an update. As an artist, I've often struggled with the tension between innovation and tradition. I've observed that many artists, particularly those aligned with right-wing ideas, tend to blindly emulate older art styles without much innovation. In my view, artists should be encouraged to create from a place of authentic individual experiences, as this kind of art offers a more honest glimpse into the human condition while also preserving value of beauty. Given that we live in an era where technology opens unprecedented avenues of diverse artistic exploration, this tension between tradition and innovation becomes even more pronounced. With that in mind, how does propertarianism balance the need for preserving cultural heritage with the equally important need for natural evolution and experimentation in fine art and architectural practices?
The intent and potential effects of art aren't a mystery. It can be judged. Subversion of norms and standards for no other reason than undermining the population can be detected. There's now a plethora of content creators to demonstrate this, such as Devon Stagwright, Stack, and American Krogan. Beyond that, innovation doesn't require undermining tradition, and if a tradition ever does stand in the way, it needs to be dealt with honestly rather than subversively.
Yeah, I would say that who's asking this, Levi, you're misunderstanding. There are those of us who are motivated by novelty. This because it generates a sense of opportunity and the stimulation of opportunity. And those of us who are motivated by predictability. In other words, our ability to determine outcomes based, in other words, our actions and behaviors that can produce outcomes, and the cumulative effect of our behaviors can produce outcomes. So what you're really you're contrasting through two things that aren't an either an or, but a both. Is there's always room for innovation. There's always room for prediction. Now, when you call it the loving the past, these people are asserting a value judgment about a form of capitalization that they depend upon. When you talk about innovation, in your sense, you're talking about the production of novelty that you can experience. That's a kind of consumption. And what the other people are doing is a kind of capitalization. And so both of these things are necessary. Martin's correct, as usual. And I'm just going to formalize it. And that there are moral, like we say, group strategies and their ethics, morals, ethics, manners, traditions, and values aren't arbitrary, and they aren't equal. They're comparable. How you manage, and they have to do with largely your demographic composition in the areas of the area of the world you live, and the traditions and institutions you're bound by. So whenever you look at this construct of human beings, you're saying, is my innovation an attempt to harm or consume capital for the purpose of novelty? In other words, am I stealing? Or is it for the purpose of identifying new opportunities without imposing upon those costs? Or, as we call editorial art or critical art, are you trying to say that this value that we had in the past is no longer, needs to be switched to value this slightly differently instead? So art can appeal to all three. It can appeal to the preservation of capital. It can talk about the improvement of capital, or it can talk about an innovation in capital. And these things are pretty easy to determine if you understand this, though I still have in my mind that I'm not sure I want artists to know all this stuff, because the random number generator in their head that we call intuition might be framed by it such that we don't know. So in other words, it might inhibit innovation. So Martin says in his first statement there, the intent and effect of art are a mystery. It can be judged. We can tell you whether art is not only good or bad in its craftsmanship, good or bad in its aesthetics, its design, and good and bad in its content. We can tell you all three of those things. And then meanwhile, we can also position as good and bad in the movement that it's a part of, because all art, like all fashion, consists inside of some sort of movement. So when you say that we can judge all these things, and the artist may not appreciate the judgment, but the artist might say that's an individual perception. And your argument here, which is you say something like you're saying something about individual truth is how you phrase it. Where is it? Certainly tension between artists should be encouraged to create from a place of authentic individual experience. Well, that's a value judgment on your statement. That means that we call that art by therapy. But some people might actually say, no, the purpose of art, which is high art in particular, is to create monuments. Monuments that are individual expressions of the time, how the tradition is expressed in time and space of the moment. So I think you're making a couple of value judgments, and they're self-serving, which is what artists do. I mean, it's not like I wasn't one of them. So you're making a value judgment that's very individualistic, that's serving your own interest, but you're looking at that as if it should be a universal, rather than you're just one Crayola crayon in the color of box of crayons of art that's being produced. That's my answer. I mean, the answer is we can tell what's bad art, and if it's bad art, it's bad art. It's bad art not because of its construction, its design, but its position. Its position in the movement. In other words, is it a good example or a bad example? But most of all, because it's doing something that improves capital or destroys capital. And piss Christ is destroy capital.
There's bad art and there's evil art.
Yes.
Can I pile something else onto this question?
Sure.
So I'm sure since you studied art in school, I'm sure, and also Chinese civilization, I'm sure you've study the differences between Western art versus Chinese art. Let's take landscape painting.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
I look at Western landscape painting and the level of detail that goes in there, the what do you call it? The contrast between light and shadow and everything looks very realistic. And when I look at a Chinese landscape painting, there's almost no shadow effects whatsoever. And the perspective, I don't know what you call it, the professional word, it looks more like there's a lack of perspective. It's almost look like everything is just, in computer graphics, if you don't correct for projection, everything can just become flat, right? It's actually possible to construct a scene like that. It almost looks like that. So what does that, when you compare and contrast between these two styles of arts, what does each say? And as you say, that art is essentially a form of monument building. What does that say about the difference between these two civilizations?
Well, I mean, it says a lot of things, and they're not directly intuitive, right? First of all, after 1500, the Chinese could have easily adopted Western methods of art, right? I mean, it was certainly possible. But that's not the
ink brushes.
What?
I mean, the Chinese, not with the traditional tools, right? Because the traditional Chinese painting were all done with these watercolor brushes and so on, and I just don't think they're physically possible of making the level of acrylic or oil painting that the Western artists do.
Well, they could have. I mean, it's a technology, right?
Okay.
I mean, so I'm trying to separate a couple of things. One is the technology. There's nothing that was. I mean, it's funny. I bought because there's an industry in China that copies European paintings, right?
No
And
idea.
they sell them. You didn't know this? So
I
I think for like $300, I bought this huge painting of a fox hunt for my house, right? Great big painting for the and it's a fox hunt. And except the eyes were Asian. They couldn't get the eyes right, which was funny, right? But you know, that's the thing. So can the technology be used? Absolutely. The technology is not a problem. The thing is, it's very hard for Westerners. It's like, you know how Muslims are very devoted to their religion, right? Everything's got in the context. Chinese art's in this tradition. It's a little bit closer to the Egyptian. When you were an Egyptian artist, right? When you did all the Egyptian stuff. There was a guy who did all the sketches there. And then you spent years learning how to do it to make it look like all other Egyptian art, right? There's an aesthetic, and it has to do with the metaphysics of East Asia, right? And that is this harmony thing, right? And so you don't, you know, do you get, I mean, there's I can't remember the name of the painting right now, but there's this painting's so German. It's Jesus on a cross and the arrows are in him and there's real blood dripping down. I mean, it's fucking gory, right? I mean, it's so German, right? I mean, but the German who did that painting didn't think of it as being so German. It was just, that's the German mind, right? Right. Well, but also it's I mean, the Renaissance painters wouldn't have done that kind of gore. It would have been more symbolic. Well, so when you go into China, you're talking about a long history of bureaucratic conformity to do characters correctly or whatever, and that becomes status. And so that symbolism works its way into the arts. And so you see this formation of the arts over time. So it's more of a design choice. In other words, than it is any particular limitation on anything else, right? Why didn't they pick up Western realism? Well, there's also the noun verb thing going on between East Asian and Western civilization, which is the harmony and the interaction between things versus the Western idea that things are discrete objects. Right, so Westerners think in terms of nouns, and Easterners think in terms of verbs, and you can see this when mothers teaching children how to play with toys. The example that what's his name gives, I think it's Huntington, is that of a Japanese woman saying, "What is the truck doing?" Whereas the European would say, "What kind of truck is this?" and it's the same thing with, I don't know if you've seen the cork, wood, steel, and ceramic shapes of pyramids, balls, cubes. And you ask Westerners to sort them together, they'll put all the shapes together, whereas Easterners will put the materials together, right? Is to align them. So you have a different metaphysics, and I'm not sure realism is part of it. And I think part of it, that absence of realism, that appeal to idealism, which you see in the Chinese paint. I'm thinking of Chinese painting in particular, and Chinese painting is because there's this whole thing about human life, right? The Greeks start this shit out with the humans are basically gods in the making, and so you get all this, but the Chinese don't have that. It's actually people are kind of vulgar or not pretty, right? And so there's this value of human life thing like that, and so this representationalism never took role. I mean, it's more the feeling of harmony is more important than the representationalism, and those two things become what artists pursue in their career. So the Europeans become a technocratic, because they always were, technocratic art, and you have the Chinese artists favoring this very stylistic art, which is, I mean, nobody's going to, I mean, you're not going to find any art historian that's going to criticize Chinese art. I mean, it's just the opposite. It's like, fuck, this is amazing shit, right? But what's valued in the art, the ideal versus the real, is very different. And it's one of those things where you say to people, we're not aware of our metaphysical value judgments, right? We're not aware of these things, but they're endemic throughout our life. I mean, we can't get away from them because we're not even aware of them. We just assume that's what it is because that's the pattern we adhere to. So how did you ask the question again?
What can you tell about this? So if the arts for these civilizations represent monuments, right? Then what can you infer about the civilization from the art itself?
Yeah, and so what you really see is you see individual dominance expression by the artist as competitive heroism, and you see in Asia you see it as I have achieved the same high rank as the masters.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically, you know, that's what's the behavioral mod. The rest of it's all the humanity versus the reality versus the idealism playing out. There's an odd negative view. I mean, I remember this. I remember being a freshman and running into this and thinking it was really weird. I'm like, why? What is going on with the Chinese perception of human beings? Because that's not what I understood as useful, right? Because our is Western is, man, it's really a supremacist thing, right? I mean, so the Greek thing is we are superior and we are transcending into gods. Godhood is available to us. There's a humility in Chinese art that is not present in
Probably because state as a first institution became so heavy, it just crushed individual spirit.
There you go, boss. Gee, you're really good at this stuff. You should join the Natural Law Institute and contribute to their thinking, because you sound just like you've mastered that stuff.
All right, thank you. That was very insightful.